Welcome to Automation OS tutorial number 3. In this tutorial, we're going to review how the sequence editor and task launcher can be used to manage resources for a manufacturing process. The idea behind this is that for a given manufacturing process, you might have a set of tasks that need to be completed, and certain tasks may only be suitable for certain pieces of equipment. For example, in this tutorial, we'll be opening a series of dialog boxes, but the dialog boxes will represent two separate robotic welders that we might use in a process. So to go over what we have here, we've set up a list of tasks. If you need to review how to create tasks in the sequence editor, you can review tutorial number 1, part 1. But here you'll see we have a task labeled specific robot welder 1, that refers to one piece of equipment, specific robot welder number 2, and that's our second robotic welder that we have. And then you'll see we have a summary task called any robot, under which there's two task calls for any available piece of equipment, or in this case any available robotic welder. So it could be done by welder number 1 or welder number 2. We'll have a fourth task that says no robot welder, so that might be a task that is requiring a different piece of equipment, so it doesn't have an effect on our robotic welders. The fifth task is all robot welders, so that requires both robot welder 1 and robot welder 2 in order to complete. And then we have two separate calls for robot welder number 1. Maybe there's a certain operation that only that robot can do, so we're going to do that twice. And then finally, our last task is no robot welder, again requiring a different piece of equipment that doesn't affect our robot welders. Something worth noting here is, even though these tasks appear in a specific order, there's really no rules or no predecessors that have been set. So if there's nothing preventing them from executing, all of the tasks will execute at once. Now, because we put constraints on the resources, which we'll see in a minute, for example, all robot welders requires both, whereas specific robot welder number 2 can only be completed with robot welder 2, and any robot welder could use any that happens to be available at that time. So how the tasks get completed will more or less determine in what order the subsequent tasks will run. If you go over to our resources tab here, you'll see that we've called out robot welder number 1 as the resource we'd like to use, and for the instance flag we have specific. So that's telling the controller that I want to perform this task only with robot welder number 1. So similarly, if we go to our call out for any robot welder, you can see that the instance flag is any for a robot welder. So it says I don't care if it's number 1 or number 2, just give me a robot welder and I can complete this task. Similarly, if we go to all robot welders, the instance flag is changed to all, requiring all robot welders when they become available all at the same time. So if we switch now to our task launcher, we are going to run our sequence, and I'll run it two different ways so you can see how the resource throttling works. When I click the launch button, several tasks will launch at once, and then it'll be up to me to hit OK to effectively complete that task and then trigger the next series of tasks that are trying to run when the correct pieces of equipment become available. So you see we have a couple dialog boxes appearing, and I am just going to switch back to our sequence editor so it'll make it a little bit easier to understand maybe what's going on in this case. So we have our sequence editor. I'll arrange the windows, the dialog boxes, so they're a little bit easier to look at. So you can see the tasks that have run are robot welder using robot welder number 1, using robot welder number 2, and two tasks that say not using any robot welder. So because these two tasks don't require a robot welder, they can run instantly, despite the fact that one is task number 4 and one is task number 8. Those are available to run instantly. Now we see our first two tasks on the list use robot welder number 1 and robot welder number 2. Those ran because those were the first on the list, but also both pieces of equipment were available. So if I close these two dialog boxes for the specific robot welders, you'll see that launches the next two, which is any robot welder. So again, as soon as robot welder number 1 became available, the first any robot welder task was run, And same thing with robot welder number 2. Those tasks required one robot welder, As soon as one became available, they launched. Now in this case, a few different things can happen. I'm going to close this second dialog box, which is tied to robot welder number 2. That's the resource that got used for that task. So if I do that, and then I close the one that is tied to specific robot welder number 1, you'll note that the task using all robot welders launches. Since the next incomplete task was all robot welders, when I completed the task occupying robot welder number 2 and then the task occupying robot welder number 1, the all task could run. Now if I close this, all robot welders, you'll see the next task on the list. Although the order in the list doesn't specifically determine when it'll run, it goes for the next available, and that's using robot welder number 1. Again, I'm going to close this. It'll call the second robot welder number 1 task. And when I close that, all the tasks requiring a robot welder will be complete, and I've just got my 2 tasks that say not using any robot welder. And you'll notice those weren't affected by the use of the robot welders, as the name would imply. Now, if I run this a second time, but I complete the tasks in a different order, you can see what effect this has on the resource throttling. So if we go back to our sequence launcher, we can click launch. We'll see the same series of dialog boxes come up. I'll go back to the sequence editor again. And arranging these, we have our not using robot welder, any robot welder. We have using robot welder number 1, a second task not using any robot welder, and then using robot welder number 2. Now in this case, I'm going to complete using robot welder number 2. And we'll see that using any robot welder comes up. So that's using robot welder number 2 right now to do this task. As far as it knows, robot welder number 1 is still occupied with the first task that it was running. If I complete this using any robot welder task, which is currently using welder number 2 at the moment, it launches the second any robot welder task. Well, it says, okay, robot number 2 completed my first any robot welder task, and when that's done, I have an available robot, so I'm going to launch the second any robot welder task. It doesn't care whether it's robot 1 or robot 2 doing it. So I'm going to complete this again, and then you'll see nothing's happened at the moment because the next task in the list is either using all robot welders or using robot welder number 1. So when I complete this task for robot welder number 1, you'll see it jumps directly to using all robot welders. Robot welder number 1 was tied up and suddenly it became available. Number 2 was available because it completed both of the any tasks, so now the task requiring both robot welders can run. And when I complete this, you'll see the call for specific robot welder number 1 runs, and close that. The second task for robot welder number 1 runs, and then I've completed the sequence, and I can close out the 2 remaining tasks. So hopefully that gives you some flavor of exactly how the sequence editor works and how the task launcher works. And that's really the power of this software, is that it gives the controller the ability to say, I need a task to be done. I know what's currently being used. I know what's not being used. And I'm going to do this in basically the most efficient order. This will actually let you use certain pieces of equipment as they become available. Now combining this with the use of predecessors, you can kind of have a blend of the two where maybe you want to do certain things in a certain order, even if it means that you have equipment sitting idle. But in between time, the logic built into the task launcher will enable it to kind of just run the tasks as the equipment's available, kind of using a common sense approach to getting the job done as quickly as possible.